A woman bought an old laboratory in the woods that nobody needed for only $300. It was empty inside, until something that people had tried to forget was discovered under the floor. This place had been hidden from everyone for decades. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are watching from. She had not been looking for a miracle, or even for a change. By the time she turned 43, she had learned to distrust words like beginning and opportunity. Life, as it had settled around her, was quieter than despair and heavier than hope. It moved in small, measurable units: the price of groceries, the remaining balance on a card she rarely used, the number of days a single can of soup could be stretched if paired with rice. She did not wake up thinking of the future. She woke up thinking of today, and whether today would demand more than she could afford to give. The divorce had been uneventful in the way that truly final things often are. No shouting, no courtroom drama, no friends choosing sides. They had simply reached the end of a long conversation neither of them remembered starting. The apartment went to him, mostly because he wanted it, and she did not want to argue. Her job followed a year later, eliminated by a restructuring plan explained in polished language that made it sound inevitable, almost kind. She had nodded, thanked them, and walked out carrying a box that held nothing she would miss. What followed was not collapse, but contraction. Her life grew smaller and more efficient. She learned how to repair things rather than replace them, how to cook meals that required only one burner, how to sleep lightly without dreaming too much. She stopped explaining herself to people. There was no audience anymore. That was why she spent her evenings scrolling through listings that most people ignored. Not houses with bright kitchens and hopeful descriptions, but the forgotten corners of the market. Foreclosed sheds, decommissioned facilities, parcels of land marked with warnings and disclaimers. Places no one wanted because wanting them required effort. She was not searching for a home in the sentimental sense. She needed space. Somewhere she could exist without being measured. Somewhere cheap enough that losing it would not destroy her. Storage, perhaps. Temporary shelter. Or, if nothing else, raw material she could dismantle and sell piece by piece. Metal had value. It always did, even when buildings did not. That was how she saw the listing. There was no photograph at first, only a block of text written in the flat, defensive tone of someone eager to avoid responsibility. Decommissioned technical object. Sold as is. No utilities. No guarantees. Access conditions unspecified. The description avoided naming what the object actually was, as if the word itself might cause trouble. It mentioned land issues, archival status, previous ownership transferred and dissolved. The price sat at the bottom like a typo, $300. She reread it twice, then a third time. Listings that cheap were usually mistakes or traps. Even scrapland carried a higher number. $300 meant someone wanted this gone, not sold. The single photograph appeared after she refreshed the page. It was blurry, taken from a distance, framed badly. Two low, rounded shapes half buried among trees, their surfaces dark with age and vegetation. They did not look large. They did not look threatening. They looked forgotten. She closed the browser and made tea, the cheap kind that tasted faintly of paper. When she came back, the listing was still there. She copied the coordinates and wrote them down on a scrap of paper, then folded it and slipped it into her pocket as if it might escape. The drive took longer than she expected. Roads narrowed, pavement turned to gravel, then to something barely distinguishable from the forest floor. Her phone lost signal early, as if relieved to be done. She parked where the path became impassable and continued on foot, carrying a backpack that held water, a flashlight, and a few tools she never traveled without anymore. The forest was dense but not hostile. It felt old in a patient way, indifferent to her presence. Moss climbed everything it could reach. Fallen branches lay where they had fallen, uncollected and unjudged. The air smelled of damp earth and slow decay, not rot, but process. When she saw the structures, she stopped without meaning to. They were smaller than the photograph suggested, or perhaps the forest made them seem that way. 2 concrete domes, each no higher than a single-story building, their curved backs emerging from the ground like the shells of something that had decided not to leave. One sat slightly higher than the other, as if placed with intention rather than symmetry. Moss covered much of their surfaces, thick and soft, broken only where cracks had allowed water to run freely. No wires, no poles, no signs of connection to anything beyond themselves. She walked around them slowly. The silence was complete, not dramatic, just thorough. There were no warning signs, no fences, no locks that had not already surrendered to time. One entrance hung open, the door warped and heavy, its hinges rusted into a permanent angle. Inside, the air was cold and metallic. The space was empty in a way that felt deliberate. Racks had been removed, cables cut cleanly rather than torn. The floor was bare concrete, stained, but intact. It did not smell abandoned, so much as cleared. She stood there longer than she intended, listening to her own breathing, waiting for something to tell her she should leave. Nothing did. The second dome was much the same, slightly smaller perhaps, or simply lower. The same absence, the same sense that whatever had once been here had been taken away carefully, not lost. She sat on a fallen beam outside and ate a sandwich she had packed without appetite. $300. The number repeated itself in her mind, not as temptation, but as a question. Who had decided this place was worth less than a used appliance? Who had gone through the trouble of emptying it, sealing parts of it, and then leaving it to disappear under moss? She imagined dismantling it slowly, selling the metal in trips. It would take time, but time was something she had. She imagined staying here for a while, just long enough to breathe without being observed. No neighbors, no rent notices, no one asking what she planned to do next. By the time she left the forest, her decision had already settled into place. It did not feel brave or reckless. It felt practical. The paperwork was almost insulting in its simplicity, a transfer of liability more than ownership. The seller, a representative of something that no longer existed in any meaningful way, made it clear that once the money changed hands, so did responsibility. There would be no support, no claims, no explanations. She nodded and signed where indicated, her name joining a line of ink that seemed too ordinary for the place it now represented. When the transaction was complete, the representative hesitated, then offered a final comment, as if out of courtesy rather than concern. "Most people don't last out there," he said. She did not ask what that meant. The drive back felt different, not lighter, but anchored. She stopped at a grocery store and bought supplies with the careful confidence of someone who knew exactly how much she could spend. Rice, canned vegetables, fuel for the small burner she owned. Nothing that would spoil quickly. That night, lying on a borrowed mattress in a borrowed room, she thought of the domes again. Not as property, but as weight. Something unwanted that had attached itself to her life. She did not yet know what it contained, only that it had been discarded deliberately. She fell asleep without dreaming, already moving toward a place that would demand more of her than silence, though she could not yet see how. She returned to the forest 3 days later with what she could carry and what she could not afford to leave behind. The decision had already hardened inside her, and with it came a quiet urgency. There was no ceremony to the move, no farewell. She closed the door of the borrowed room, returned the key, and loaded her car until the suspension dipped slightly, as if acknowledging a new and heavier purpose. Tools were packed first, then clothes rolled tight to save space, then boxes of food chosen for endurance rather than pleasure. Everything had a reason. Everything had a limit. The road seemed narrower on the second trip, the turns sharper. Gravel snapped under the tires, and branches brushed the sides of the car with the indifferent familiarity of things that did not move aside. When the path became impassable again, she parked where she had before and finished the journey on foot, making multiple trips, pacing herself, learning immediately what the place would demand from her body. The forest did not assist. It did not resist either. It simply waited. She chose the higher dome as her base, not because it looked better, but because water would drain away from it more easily. Inside, she cleared a corner first, pushing aside scraps of rusted metal and fragments of dismantled frames. The emptiness inside the structure revealed itself slowly. It was not the simple absence of furniture, but a careful vacancy, as if the space had been stripped with intention. Where bolts remained, they had been loosened, not torn. Where panels had been removed, the edges were smooth. She laid out her things in a pattern that mirrored her thinking. The burner near the entrance for ventilation, the mattress against the curved wall where the ceiling dipped lowest, creating a sense of shelter within the larger hollow. Tools arranged within reach, not neatly, but logically. She worked until her hands ached, then worked a little longer, driven by the need to establish order before night fell. The first evening was colder than she had anticipated. The concrete held the chill of the ground and returned it without hesitation. She cooked rice and canned beans, ate slowly, listening to the sounds that filtered through the dome's shell. Wind moving through branches, distant animal calls, the occasional creak of the structure settling into its own weight. None of it sounded threatening. None of it sounded welcoming either. Sleep came in fragments. The mattress was thin, the ground unforgiving. She woke often, each time orienting herself, reminding her body where it was. By morning, her muscles protested the new arrangement, but the protest was familiar, almost reassuring. Pain, she understood. Pain meant effort. Days took shape around simple tasks. She hauled water from the stream, boiling it in batches, storing it in containers scavenged from her supplies. She patched small leaks where rain found its way through hairline cracks, using sealant sparingly, knowing she would need it again. She experimented with insulation, layering fabric and salvaged material against the coldest sections of the wall. None of it transformed the space, but it made survival less costly. Food was reduced to function. She ate what would last, what required minimal fuel. Tea became a luxury measured in cups per day. She learned how far the light from her lantern reached and planned her evenings accordingly. The second dome remained untouched at first, a presence she acknowledged but did not yet approach. There was time for that later. As the routine settled, so did the silence. It was not empty silence, but a layered one, filled with distant movement and the soft persistence of the forest. She found that she could think here without effort. Thoughts arrived and departed without demanding conclusions. It wasn't peace exactly, but it was close enough to breathe. It was during one of these quiet afternoons that she noticed the temperature difference. She had been moving debris near the center of the higher dome, lifting a warped metal panel that had once served some structural purpose. The panel was cold, as expected, but the concrete beneath it was not. It was not warm in the way sunlight warms a surface, but neutral, almost insulated, as if the cold had failed to reach it. She crouched, pressed her palm flat against the floor, then against the surrounding area. The contrast was subtle but undeniable. She told herself there were explanations. Differences in soil density, air pockets, old insulation left behind. The mind, she knew, was excellent at inventing patterns where none existed. She marked the spot with a piece of chalk and moved on. Other small irregularities followed. Sounds changed underfoot in certain places, duller, less resonant. A faint hum she thought she heard once, then never again. She dismissed it as fatigue, as imagination fueled by isolation. She had no desire to uncover mysteries. Mysteries implied obligation. Rain arrived one night without warning, heavy and relentless. Water tested every repair she had made and found them wanting. She spent hours moving containers, adjusting tarps, catching drips in whatever would hold them. By morning, she was exhausted and damp, her patience worn thin. It was then that she crossed to the second dome, driven not by curiosity, but by necessity. She needed materials she could not spare from her own shelter. The second dome greeted her with the same emptiness, but it felt different. Smaller, perhaps, or simply closer to the ground. The air was still, untouched by the drafts that moved through the other structure. She worked methodically, prying loose panels, salvaging fasteners. It was here that she noticed the markings on the wall, faded paint forming symbols she did not recognize, technical rather than decorative. They had not been placed to be seen for long. She felt watched for the first time that evening, not by anything specific, but by the idea that this place had been designed for a purpose that did not include her. The feeling passed as quickly as it came, leaving behind a mild unease she could not fully explain. When she returned to her own dome, carrying what she had gathered, she paused again over the marked spot on the floor. The chalk line was still there, undisturbed. She knelt, listening, pressing her ear to the concrete, as if that might reveal something she was not yet ready to know. It revealed nothing. That night, she dreamed for the first time since arriving. The dream was not vivid, but it was persistent. She stood beneath the domes as they were when first built, clean and unmarked, the forest younger around them. People moved in and out, their faces blurred, their voices indistinct. Somewhere beneath her feet, something continued to work, unseen and unacknowledged. She woke before dawn, unsettled, her body heavy with the residue of images she could not quite recall. The forest outside was quiet, waiting for the day to begin. She sat on the edge of the mattress, wrapping herself in a blanket, and considered the chalk mark again. She did not move toward it. Not yet. Instead, she went about her morning as usual, cooking, cleaning, maintaining the fragile balance she had established. But the thought remained, a small pressure at the back of her mind. There was more to this place than emptiness. Not danger, necessarily, but intention. And intention, once noticed, could not be ignored forever. As the day wore on, clouds gathered again, promising more rain. She looked at the domes, at the forest pressing in around them, and felt the first true sense of commitment. She had bought what no one wanted, and in doing so, she had inherited not just a structure, but a silence that seemed increasingly deliberate. Whatever lay beneath it had been left behind on purpose, and now it was hers to live above, whether she understood it or not. The thought did not come to her all at once. It arrived gradually, in the way certain realizations do, not as a revelation, but as an accumulation. By the time she accepted it, it no longer felt like curiosity. It felt like obligation. For several days after the rain, she avoided the marked place on the floor. She worked around it, stepped over it, pretended it was nothing more than a trick of material and temperature. Routine helped. Repetition dulled the edge of the question that waited beneath her awareness. She told herself that she had come here to survive quietly, not to uncover someone else's unfinished business. But the dome resisted being reduced to routine. Small details continued to assert themselves, persistent and inconvenient. The faint neutrality of the concrete, where cold should have settled. The way sound seemed to flatten in that area, footsteps losing their echo, as if absorbed by something below. Once, late at night, she woke convinced she had heard a low, steady vibration, not loud enough to be sound, more like pressure. It stopped when she stood up, leaving her alone with the sense that she had interrupted something. She began to measure without admitting she was measuring. Distances from the walls, the curve of the dome relative to the marked spot. She checked old technical manuals she carried for unrelated reasons, looking for nothing in particular and finding nothing at all. Still, the thought remained, growing heavier the longer she resisted it. On the morning she finally acted, there was no drama in the decision. The forest was wrapped in fog, the kind that muted color and softened edges. Visibility was limited, the world reduced to what stood closest. She drank her tea slowly, ate without appetite, then gathered her tools with the deliberate care of someone preparing for work rather than discovery. The concrete resisted at first, not in strength, but in indifference. She pried up the warped metal panel she had uncovered earlier and set it aside. Beneath it, the surface looked seamless, uninterrupted. If there was something there, it had been hidden well. She tapped the floor with the handle of a wrench, listening. The sound changed subtly near the chalk mark, duller, less immediate. Her pulse quickened, not with fear, but with confirmation. This was not imagination. This was construction. It took hours to find the edge of it, a seam so fine it disappeared unless the light struck it at exactly the right angle. Dust filled the air as she worked, the smell of old concrete and metal coating her tongue. When the seam finally gave, it did so reluctantly, revealing a circular outline beneath the surface. The hatch was heavy, far heavier than she had expected. It had been designed to stay closed. She braced herself, shifting her weight, using leverage rather than force. The first movement came with a sound she felt in her chest, a deep, resistant groan that seemed to echo downward rather than outward. Cold air rose from the opening, dry and clean, carrying no hint of decay. She stood over it for a long moment, breathing, letting the reality of the opening settle. This was not a crawl space or a forgotten utility access. This was deliberate, engineered concealment. The ladder was narrow, bolted securely into the concrete shaft. She tested it, then descended slowly, each step taking her further from the dome she knew and deeper into something she did not. The light from above diminished quickly, replaced by the focused beam of her flashlight. The walls were smooth, uncracked, untouched by moisture. Whoever had built this had expected it to last. At the bottom, the shaft opened into a room that should not have existed. It was not large, but it was complete. The air was cool and dry, the temperature steady in a way the surface never achieved. Surfaces were clean, preserved rather than abandoned. Metal cabinets lined one wall, their surfaces dulled but intact. A control panel stood opposite them, its indicators dark but intact, waiting rather than dead. She stood still, overwhelmed, not by fear, but by precision. This place had not been forgotten. It had been sealed. Her flashlight swept across the room, catching details that reinforced the same conclusion. Wiring carefully routed and insulated. Labels intact, printed rather than handwritten. Everything suggested a system designed to function autonomously, isolated from the outside world. She approached the control panel cautiously. The design was unfamiliar but not alien, a blend of older analog components and robust mechanical switches. She did not touch anything at first. Instead, she traced the lines with her eyes, trying to understand the logic before committing to action. The generator sat partially enclosed behind a protective barrier. Compact, dense, built for longevity rather than efficiency. She recognized the principles even if the specific implementation eluded her. This was not experimental chaos. This was conservative engineering, built to operate without supervision. She found the main switch after several minutes of careful inspection. It was recessed, protected from accidental contact. Her hand hovered over it, her mind replaying every sensible reason not to proceed. Whatever this system powered had been meant to remain hidden. Activating it would announce its existence in ways she could not predict. She flipped the switch. The response was immediate, but restrained. No explosion of sound, no dramatic surge. A low, steady hum filled the room, barely audible but unmistakable. Lights along the panel flickered, then stabilized, bathing the space in a soft, even glow. The air felt different, charged, but controlled. She exhaled, realizing she had been holding her breath. With the system active, other elements revealed themselves. Indicators stabilized. A ventilation system engaged quietly, circulating air with almost imperceptible movement. Whatever this place had been, it had been designed to wait, dormant but ready. The cabinets contained the heart of it. She opened them one by one, her movements slow, respectful despite herself. Inside were boxes, sealed and labeled, documents preserved in plastic and metal, microfilm reels stored in protective cases, everything organized, indexed, intentional. She pulled one file at random and opened it. The language was technical, precise, devoid of commentary. Reports, tables, procedural summaries. Names appeared without context, accompanied by identifiers rather than titles. Funding pathways described in neutral terms that masked their significance. She did not understand everything, but she understood enough to feel the shift inside her. This was not abandoned research. This was evidence. She sat on the floor and read until her legs cramped and her eyes burned. Patterns emerged slowly, like an image developing in a dark room. This place had been part of a network, small, localized, designed to operate below notice. Experiments conducted under the protection of contracts that no longer officially existed. Oversight structures dissolved on paper while remaining intact in practice. The realization did not frighten her. It steadied her. By the time she climbed back up into the dome, the light outside had changed. The fog had lifted, revealing the forest in sharp relief. She closed the hatch carefully, restoring the floor as best she could. Though she knew the knowledge of what lay beneath could not be undone, she sat against the curved wall, exhaustion settling into her bones. The domes no longer felt empty. They felt occupied by something unseen, something patient. She had not gone looking for secrets, but she had found them nonetheless. As night approached, she cooked without tasting the food, her thoughts anchored below the surface. The hum from beneath her feet was no longer audible, but she felt it all the same, a steady presence that refused to be ignored. She had bought what no one wanted, believing it to be nothing more than a shell. Now she understood why it had been so cheap. It was not worthless. It was inconvenient. Dangerous, perhaps, not because it threatened directly, but because it remembered. Sleep came late and fitfully. When she finally drifted off, the dream returned, clearer this time. The domes were active, people moving with purpose, their faces still indistinct. Beneath it all, the system worked as it had been designed to do, indifferent to time, waiting for someone to notice. When she woke, the forest was silent again. But the silence no longer felt empty. It felt charged, as if the act of uncovering had altered the balance. She did not yet know what that would cost her, only that there was no returning to ignorance. Whatever had been buried beneath the domes was awake now, and sooner or later, someone else would realize it. The change did not announce itself with a single event. It crept in through small disturbances that, taken alone, could be dismissed, but together formed a pattern too precise to ignore. After the night, she sealed the hatch, and lay awake, listening to a silence that now felt inhabited. The forest seemed to acquire a different posture. It was the same trees, the same undergrowth and damp earth, yet the sense of isolation that had once wrapped around the domes like insulation began to thin. Distance no longer felt like protection. It felt like a corridor. At first, the signs were almost insulting in their subtlety, a faint discoloration in the soil near the edge of the clearing, where tires might have compressed the ground and then moved on. The absence of birds at dawn, not all of them, just enough to make the morning feel unfinished. Once, while hauling water from the stream, she noticed that the surface had been disturbed upstream, the ripples traveling toward her as if carrying news she could not yet hear. She told herself it was coincidence. The mind, when left alone for too long, reached for meaning the way the body reached for warmth. She had read enough of the documents below to know how easily paranoia could be manufactured. She did not want to become another footnote in a history of people who imagined enemies where there were none. But the hum beneath her feet, though inaudible, seemed to give the days a rhythm she could not escape. It was as if the system below had drawn a thin line outward, connecting itself to the world it had been designed to avoid. Whatever power source sustained it had been meant to endure, not to announce. And yet endurance itself left traces. The first direct contact came in the form of a letter. It was tucked into a plastic sleeve, weighed down by a stone near the edge of the clearing, placed where it could not have arrived by accident. She did not touch it immediately. She stood several steps away, scanning the forest, listening. Nothing moved. The letter did not look threatening. No seals, no logos, no urgent markings. Just her name, spelled correctly, printed rather than written. She read it inside the dome, the door closed, the lantern turned low. The language was courteous, almost apologetic. It referenced a routine review of decommissioned sites, an update to archival records, a desire to ensure that privately owned properties did not pose environmental or safety risks. There was no accusation, no demand, only an invitation to confirm ownership details and allow a brief inspection by authorized personnel. A phone number was provided. No agency name appeared at the top. Her first reaction was irritation. She had purchased the property legally. The paperwork, sparse as it was, had transferred responsibility clearly. There was nothing routine about a letter delivered by hand to a location that did not officially exist. She folded it carefully and placed it with the documents she had begun to keep organized, a growing stack that represented both knowledge and liability. She did not call. The next day, a vehicle appeared at the edge of the forest. It did not approach the domes directly. It parked at a distance, partially obscured by trees, its presence suggested rather than declared. She watched it from inside the dome, her view framed by the warped doorway. Two figures remained inside for a long time, the engine off. Then one stepped out, walked a short distance, and stopped. No binoculars, no obvious surveillance equipment. Just a man standing still, as if listening. When he returned to the vehicle, it drove away without having accomplished anything visible. The forest reclaimed the space quickly, the silence rushing back to fill the gap. Her hand shook slightly as she poured water to boil, though she did not feel afraid. Fear required clarity. What she felt instead was confirmation. She began to prepare without fully admitting what she was preparing for. The documents below were sorted more carefully now, grouped by date and subject. She read more slowly, cross-referencing names, building a mental map of relationships that extended far beyond the domes. Some of the names appeared again and again, always attached to different entities, different funding lines, different responsibilities. They were not ghosts, they were active. The first offer came 2 days later. This time, there was no pretense of routine. A man arrived alone, on foot, following the path as if he had walked it before. He stopped at a respectful distance hands visible, posture open. She watched him through the doorway, measuring the cadence of his steps, the way he waited rather than calling out. When she finally approached, she did not invite him inside. He did not ask. He spoke carefully, choosing words that sounded reasonable without quite forming a request. He acknowledged the unusual nature of the property, expressed understanding for her position, and then made the offer. A sum that bore no relationship to $300, or to scrap metal prices, or to the value of abandoned concrete in a forest. It was an amount designed to end conversations. She listened without interrupting, her face giving nothing away. When he finished, she asked a single question. Why now? He smiled, a gesture that revealed nothing. Because sometimes it was better to resolve matters cleanly, he said, to prevent complications. She declined. The smile did not disappear. It adjusted. He reminded her, gently, that complicated properties often attracted complicated attention. That oversight, once initiated, tended to expand. That cooperation was usually less expensive than resistance. He left her with a number that was not the one from the letter, then turned and walked back into the forest without waiting for a response. That night, she did not sleep. The pressure did not escalate immediately. It refined itself. A second letter arrived, more formal this time, referencing the first. A notice of inspection with a date attached. She read it carefully, noting the phrasing, the legal ambiguities. The date was soon enough to be inconvenient, but far enough away to feel deliberate. She considered leaving. The thought came uninvited, but persistent. She could pack what she could carry, erase her tracks as best she knew how, disappear into the anonymity she had once relied upon. The domes would remain. The system below would continue its quiet labor until someone else found it, or until it failed. She would be free of it. The thought did not comfort her. Leaving would not erase the knowledge she carried now. The documents had already shifted her understanding of how easily silence could be purchased, how efficiently responsibility could be reassigned. She thought of the people whose names appeared in those files, their lives continuing uninterrupted, while their past actions lay sealed beneath her feet. Walking away felt less like self-preservation and more like complicity. She stayed. The man from the letter arrived on the morning of the inspection, precisely on time. He introduced himself by name only, offered identification she examined without comment, and waited for permission she did not give. When she gestured for him to follow, it was not an invitation so much as an acknowledgement that resistance would now take a different form. He moved through the dome slowly, observing without touching. His questions were measured, factual. When he asked about utilities, she told the truth without elaboration. There were none. When he asked about modifications, she pointed to the repairs she had made. He took notes, his expression neutral. It was only when they stood near the center of the dome that something shifted. His gaze lingered on the floor, not on the chalk mark she had erased days earlier, but on the space itself, as if he sensed the absence beneath it. He said nothing. She said nothing. The moment passed, but it left behind a residue of awareness that neither could deny. When the inspection concluded, he did not make promises. He thanked her for her cooperation and said the findings would be reviewed. He paused at the doorway, then spoke again, this time without the careful distance he had maintained until then. Some places, he said, were better left alone. They carried histories that did not benefit from daylight. She met his gaze evenly. Some histories, she replied, were already awake. He nodded once and left. By the end of the week, the domes no longer felt like refuge. They felt like a boundary. She sensed attention, not as presence, but as orientation, as if distant systems had adjusted their focus. The forest remained unchanged, but her relationship to it had shifted. She was no longer invisible here. On the 7th day after the inspection, another visitor arrived. This one did not bring letters or offers. He brought credentials, this time bearing a name she recognized immediately, one that carried weight and consequence. Federal Bureau of Investigation. He introduced himself calmly, his demeanor unremarkable, almost understated. He explained that he had questions related to historical activities in the area, and that her property had appeared in a long dormant file. He did not accuse, he did not threaten. He asked if she would be willing to talk. She studied him for a long moment, measuring something deeper than his words. There was curiosity in his eyes, but also restraint. He was not here to close a matter quickly. He was here because something had refused to stay closed. She nodded and stepped aside, allowing him into the dome. As the door closed behind them, she felt the last vestige of her earlier solitude dissolve. Whatever had been buried beneath the domes had done more than awaken. It had drawn attention, and attention, once fixed, did not easily let go. The forest outside remained silent, but inside, the quiet had changed. It was no longer empty. It was waiting. The agent did not sit until she did. When he finally lowered himself onto the crate she indicated, he placed his notebook on his knee and closed it without opening a page, as if to signal that whatever was about to be said would not be reduced to lines and margins. He looked around the dome once more, not as an inspector now, but as someone measuring the distance between what a place pretended to be and what it actually contained. He began by asking questions that were easy to answer. When she had purchased the property, what she had found upon arrival, what repairs she had made. His voice remained steady, neutral, but attentive in a way that suggested he was listening not just for facts, but for what those facts implied. She answered plainly, neither embellishing nor withholding. She had learned that lies complicated the future more than truth ever did. When he asked about the floor, he did not point. He did not need to. She felt the question settle where the hatch lay hidden beneath concrete and intent. She did not answer immediately. Silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but loaded. Then she said that she had found something beneath the structure that did not match the public record. She did not elaborate. She waited. He nodded once, slowly. He did not look surprised. They moved below together, the descent careful and deliberate. The latter accepted his weight without complaint. When they reached the bottom, the room revealed itself again, unchanged, but no longer private. The lights hummed softly. The cabinets waited. The agent stood still, taking it in, his expression tightening just enough to betray recognition. He did not touch anything until she gestured toward the documents. Then he approached the cabinets, opened one, and began to read. The shift in him was subtle but unmistakable. His shoulders squared, his breathing slowed. The professional mask did not fall away, but something beneath it became visible, something that had been held in reserve for a long time. They spent hours there. He read methodically, cross-checking names and dates, asking occasional questions that revealed how deeply these files intersected with a web he already knew. She watched him piece together the connections she had only begun to suspect. This was not discovery for him. It was confirmation. At last, he closed a file and looked at her directly. He asked how much she understood of what she had found. She told him the truth, enough to know it was dangerous, enough to know it mattered. He exhaled, a sound of restrained frustration. He told her then that he had been assigned to a series of cases that never seemed to end, investigations that stalled just short of resolution, always missing one piece of documentation, one traceable transaction, one credible witness. He spoke without bitterness, but with the weariness of someone who had learned how systems protected themselves, not through force, but through delay. What lay beneath her domes, he said, filled gaps that had remained empty for decades. They returned to the surface as the light outside shifted toward evening. The forest had grown still, as if listening. Back in the dome, he finally opened his notebook and began to write. Not notes, but a list. Names, references, points of contact. When he finished, he closed it again and met her gaze. There would be consequences, he said, for her and for him. Once this information entered the system officially, it would not move quickly, but it would move relentlessly. The structures named in those files had survived because they were patient and because they relied on silence. Bringing the truth forward would not be met with gratitude. She asked him what he intended to do. He hesitated, and in that hesitation, she saw the shape of the choice before him. He explained that his superiors would not thank him for reopening dormant threads, that there would be pressure to classify, to contain, to reduce what they had found to an archival anomaly. He had been ordered in the past to let similar things go, to write reports that concluded without conclusions. And yet, he said, this was different. This time, the evidence was not abstract. It existed in a place that had been intentionally erased from public memory, preserved not by accident, but by design. And this time, there was a civilian owner, a witness who had not sought involvement, but could not plausibly be dismissed. She understood then that his presence here was not accidental. He had been sent to assess whether this could be contained quietly, whether she could be persuaded, compensated, intimidated into compliance. He had not yet decided how to answer that question. The order arrived the next morning. It came by secure channel, brief and unambiguous. The materials were to be taken into custody. The site was to be sealed pending review. Ownership issues would be addressed later. There was no mention of her role beyond a note that cooperation was expected. He read the message in silence, then handed the device to her. She read it carefully, noting what it did not say, as much as what it did. There was no guarantee of protection, no acknowledgement of risk. The language assumed compliance as a given. When she returned the device, their eyes met again, and the weight of the moment settled fully between them. She did not plead. She did not argue. She waited. He told her what would happen if he followed the order. The documents would disappear into a review process that might last years. The site would be restricted, then forgotten. She would receive a settlement framed as a resolution, and nothing would change. He told her what would happen if he did not. He would escalate the findings beyond his immediate chain of command, triggering oversight mechanisms that could not be quietly dismantled. It would make enemies. It would end his career as he knew it. It might not even succeed. She asked him what he wanted. The question surprised him. He considered it longer than he expected to. At last, he said that he wanted the truth to exist somewhere. It could not be buried again. He did not claim nobility. He did not speak of justice. He spoke of exhaustion with lies that survived simply because no one was willing to carry their weight. She told him that she had not come here to become a symbol or a martyr, that she wanted to live, quietly if possible. But she also told him that walking away now felt like a betrayal of the one thing she had gained since arriving: clarity. He looked at her, really looked at her, as if seeing her not as an inconvenience or a variable, but as a person who had been forced into proximity with something larger than herself and had not looked away. He made his decision. He would not seize the documents under the initial order. Instead, he would formally log their existence, file a report that triggered mandatory review by independent oversight, and request protective status for both the site and its owner. He would do it by the book, but at the highest level the book allowed, leaving a trail that could not be erased without visibility. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was procedural, and that, she realized, was precisely why it mattered. The days that followed were tense, but strangely calm. Communications increased, then stalled. Requests for access were made, then deferred. The forest remained unchanged, but the world beyond it had begun to turn, slowly and with resistance. On the evening before the first external team was scheduled to arrive, they stood outside the domes together. The moss glowed faintly in the fading light. The structures looked no different than they had weeks earlier, unremarkable, almost humble. She asked him if he regretted it. He did not answer immediately. Then he said that regret was a luxury he had stopped trusting. Choices, he said, were easier to live with than their alternatives. As he prepared to leave for the night, she watched him walk back along the path, his figure gradually swallowed by the trees. For the first time since she had arrived, the silence did not feel like something pressing in on her. It felt like something holding, steady and unyielding. The choice had been made. Not loudly, not heroically, but with the kind of resolve that endured. Whatever came next would come because someone had refused to let a buried truth remain buried. And that, she understood, was how real change began. The first convoy arrived without ceremony, as if aware that spectacle would only invite resistance. 2 unmarked vehicles eased along the narrow track at dawn, stopping where the forest allowed no further progress. The people who stepped out moved with the careful economy of those trained to minimize their footprint. They did not look around in wonder. They looked around in calculation. Equipment cases were carried by hand. Voices were kept low. Nothing about their presence suggested conquest or rescue. It suggested procedure. She watched from the doorway of the higher dome, wrapped in a jacket that had become more necessity than habit. The forest held its breath, the way it always did at that hour, dew clinging to moss and needles. The domes, unchanged in their outlines, seemed almost embarrassed by the attention. She felt a strange urge to apologize to them, as if she had broken a promise she never remembered making. The agent arrived shortly after, walking rather than riding, his presence more familiar than comforting. He did not greet her at first. He surveyed the scene with the same restrained focus he had brought from the beginning, noting where equipment was set down, where people clustered. Only then did he nod to her, a small acknowledgement that carried more weight than words. What followed unfolded slowly, deliberately. Access was documented. The hatch was opened under observation, the seal recorded, the ladder tested again by hands other than hers. The hum below was measured, catalogued, described in language that reduced its persistence to acceptable terms. She stood aside and let them work, answering questions when asked, withholding nothing and adding nothing unnecessary. There was relief in that, in no longer being the sole bearer of knowledge that wanted to be shared, but had no place to go. The documents were handled with care that bordered on reverence. Each file was photographed in situ before being removed. Each label was logged. Microfilm reels were counted twice. The process was slower than she had expected, but she understood why. Speed would have implied urgency, and urgency invited shortcuts. This was meant to last. By the second day, additional personnel arrived, their roles distinct but coordinated. Environmental specialists tested soil and air. Engineers assessed structural integrity, their conversations dense with technical shorthand. At no point did anyone suggest that the site should never have been found. The unspoken agreement was clear. It existed. Therefore, it had to be addressed. She was interviewed formally on the 3rd day. Not interrogated, not cross-examined. Interviewed. The distinction mattered. She spoke of the purchase, the emptiness, the discovery. She described her reasoning in plain terms, resisting the urge to justify choices that had felt inevitable at the time. The person taking her statement listened without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification, never implying fault. When it was finished, she signed her name at the bottom of a transcript, that ran longer than any document she had signed before. The pen felt heavy in her hand. She wondered briefly if that signature would follow her for the rest of her life. Then she set the pen down and stood, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. The announcement came quietly. The site was to be designated for investigation and preservation pending further review. Ownership would remain with her for the time being, subject to restrictions that were explained clearly and without threat. Compensation would be addressed through proper channels. She was offered temporary relocation during active operations. She declined. The forest did not change in response to the news. It did not celebrate or retreat. It continued to exist on its own terms. The domes, however, began to transform in small, respectful ways. Sections of moss were cleared where documentation required it, leaving soft green islands amid exposed concrete. Temporary lighting was installed, not to banish the dark, but to map it. Paths were reinforced, not widened. The place retained its character, even as it acquired witnesses. She adapted to the new rhythm with cautious acceptance. There were more people now, more movement, more voices. But there were also boundaries, clearly marked and carefully observed. Her space remained her own. No one entered her dome without asking. No one touched her belongings. It was a courtesy she had not expected, and it mattered more than she would have admitted. The agent visited often during those weeks, sometimes to discuss developments, sometimes simply to walk the perimeter with her. Their conversations were measured, never drifting into familiarity, but shedding formality with each passing day. He told her, when asked, that the report he had filed had traveled exactly as he intended. Slowly at first, then with increasing inevitability. Oversight bodies had been engaged. Questions had been raised in rooms not accustomed to being questioned. There were attempts to soften the process, to frame the findings as historical anomalies rather than ongoing concerns. Those attempts met resistance, not from outrage, but from documentation. The kind that did not argue, only persisted. One afternoon, as autumn edged closer and the forest began its subtle shift toward decay, he told her that he had been reassigned. Not removed, not punished, but redirected. It was the kind of reassignment that sounded neutral and felt consequential. He did not say whether he would accept it. She asked what that meant for the investigation. It would continue, he said. Others would carry it forward. That had been the point all along. He smiled then, briefly, without humor or regret. Systems, he said, were most threatened not by defiance, but by continuity. When he left that evening, he did not promise to return. He did not need to. Some connections did not depend on proximity. Winter arrived early. The first frost glazed the moss, turning green to silver. The domes held their ground, the cold sliding over them rather than into them. Inside, the temperature remained steady, the quiet hum below a constant reassurance. The system had been integrated into monitoring protocols, its autonomy respected, even as its outputs were finally acknowledged. She adjusted her routines again, this time with a sense of permanence she had not allowed herself before. Supplies arrived more regularly, though never excessively. The path was maintained just enough to remain passable. She learned the names of a few of the people who came and went, learned which questions to answer and which to defer. She learned, most importantly, that her presence here was no longer provisional. Compensation arrived in increments rather than a single sum, structured to avoid spectacle. It was enough to secure her position without transforming her life beyond recognition. She accepted it with gratitude and caution, aware that stability was more valuable to her now than abundance. On a morning thick with fog, she walked the perimeter alone, tracing the boundary between forest and human intention. The domes loomed gently behind her, neither hidden nor exposed. They looked as they always had, and yet entirely different. No longer forgotten. No longer silent by design. She stopped where the ground dipped slightly, where moss had been cleared, and then allowed to return. She thought of the person she had been when she first read the listing, measuring life in cans and miles. She thought of how easily she might have scrolled past, dismissed the number as an error, chosen comfort over inconvenience. What remained was not triumph. It was not vindication. It was continuity. A place that would no longer vanish into paperwork, a truth that had acquired witnesses and therefore weight. A life that had found an anchor, not in escape, but in attention. That evening, as light faded and the forest resumed its patient listening, she stood at the entrance to the higher dome and watched the day end. Somewhere beyond the trees, processes moved forward, slow and imperfect. Here, beneath her feet, the system continued to do what it had always done, quietly and without complaint. She closed the door against the cold and sat, feeling the steadiness of the place settle around her. The silence returned, but it was no longer empty. It held memory. It held intention. It held the knowledge that some things, once uncovered, did not need to be shouted to endure. They only needed someone willing to stand where they were and refuse to look away. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to the channel to see what comes next. Watch the other videos on the channel for more stories like this, and share this video with someone who might appreciate it.